Good evening, and welcome to the Bible class on the book of Revelation for the Citrus Park Church of Christ on this Wednesday evening. We are grateful that you can join us as we are meeting virtually for these midweek sessions. And this particular class brings us just about halfway through the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, as we've been mentioning, has two basic parts, the first 11 chapters, and then the second 11 chapters is the second part. And we'll look at some of the review of some of the seven seals and also the seven trumpets in just a moment. But it's rather convenient that we have 11 chapters for one half of the book and 11 chapters for the second half of the book. This study, as we've been exploring, is a very fascinating look into apocalyptic literature in the Bible. This book is called the Apocalypse because it is filled with symbols and figures and images that are designed to put pictures in our minds that we can understand a little easier some of the spiritual realities that are described in the book. And as we think about the situation in the seven churches of Asia in the first century, we understand that they were desperately in need for encouragement and some kind of information that would pump them up to remain faithful in the face of horrible ordeals, persecutions, and tribulations. And the message is able to come at that particular time to assist them in this time of crisis with a lot of images, allusions to the Old Testament. There is probably no other book in the Bible that is packed with allusions to other passages in the Bible, certainly from the Old Testament, than the book of Revelation. And so we'll be exploring even some of these as we continue to look at this tonight. Before we proceed in the textual analysis of chapter 12, let's just take a look back into the images and the series of images that are being presented by the writer John in this book. On this particular slide, you can see that we have a summary of the seven seals that are described for us in Revelation chapter 6. We also have a description briefly of the seven trumpets that are described for us in chapters 8 and 9 of the book of Revelation. And then also on the right-hand side, the third column of this slide, you can see the seven bowls of wrath that are enumerated for the most part in chapter 16 of the book of Revelation. And so you see that there are six items in the seals, six seals. Before the seventh seal is presented, there is a pause or an interlude. And this interlude is strategic because it sets up suspense. We're all kind of anticipating what's going to happen when the Lamb opens the seventh seal on the scroll. But there is a timeout, there's an interlude, there's a pause concerning the redeemed, and this is found in chapter 7, where there is the 144,000 and the great multitude, which is simply to describe the people of God. No harm and wrath is going to be proceeding until God has identified those that belong to him. And his people are going to be protected. They're the ones that are going to be surviving this crisis. Even if they have to give up their lives in the process, they will ultimately be survivors in heaven. And they will ultimately be victorious with other Christians and with Christ in heaven. The problem is that they are facing a trial and a tribulation, an ordeal, and a dismal set of affairs in the context of emperor worship in the first century during the Roman Empire. And this is true whether we think about the book describing mainly the events prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, or even later on toward the end of the first century, where the expansion of persecution by the Emperor Domitian really started to get across the entire Mediterranean basin at that time. And then in the middle column here, you see 7 trumpets, and we've just been finishing that particular series of visions where there is hail, fire, and blood, and so forth. And there are all of these horrible things that are going to come upon the earth dwellers. The sun and the moon are darkened. You have this kind of apocalyptic imagery. And there's going to be an interlude here also between the 6th and the 7th trumpet concerning the 2 witnesses. And we talked about this last time in chapter 11, where there is the description of the measuring of the temple. There are the 2 witnesses, there are the 2 lamps, there are also the 2 prophets, and all of these different series of 2 are focusing on God's people. That is, God's people are the ones that are going to be witnessing before all of the world earth dwellers. And they're going to be letting their light so shine before men, even the earth dwellers, even those whose interest and their allegiance is not to heaven but to earth and the physical material world that it is involved with. Those people are going to see the Christians who are living in a strategically different manner, spiritually focused on serving God in the midst of all of the issues that they have to deal with. And so just as there was a pause between the 6th seal and the 7th seal, there is now a pause here between the 6th trumpet and the 7th trumpet. When the 7th trumpet is sounding, then you see all of this wonderful consummation of events that we were reading about in chapter 11 at the end of the chapter. And that brings us to chapter 12, which is a new sort of like a flashback. It's going back to other events that had taken place earlier. So let's take a look. And a great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child, and she cried out in her pangs of birth, in anguish for delivery. And another portent appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on the heads. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven, and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, that he might devour her child when she brought it forth. She brought forth a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which to be nourished for 1,260 days. This word portent is the Greek word semeion, and we sometimes use it translated into English by a sign. A great sign or wonder appeared in heaven. And so this is a heavenly description. It's a spiritual dimension. And as we were mentioning a while back, thinking about the book of Ephesians, there's this passage in chapter 6 of Ephesians that talks about the kind of struggle that Christians are involved with. And Paul talks about this in verse 12. He says that we are not contending against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. The description is really talking about the kind of struggle that Christians are involved with their entire lives. we are not fighting against flesh and blood. It's not a physical battle like we might think of it, armies fighting each other, but this is a spiritual struggle, even as the Apostle Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 7, that it is an inner war. It's the war between the law of the mind and spirit and the law of the body and carnality of the physical body. And the idea is to win this struggle. Jesus, as the book of Hebrews tells us, was tempted in every point like we are, and yet he never sinned. He was tempted by the devil. And I think there's also an allusion to the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness in this particular passage. Before we look at kind of a verse-by-verse analysis of chapter 12, let me just mention, just generally speaking, that as we've been looking at four main approaches or four different ways that commentators and scholars and readers of the book have interpreted the apocalypse over the years, that there are the continuous historical approach, a preterist approach, a futurist approach, and an idealist approach. When we think about the preterist approach, there are a couple of categories of classifications. There are those scholars like David Chilton, Milton Terry, Stuart Russell, Philip Carrington, and maybe some writers that you might be more familiar with, Foy Wallace and Art Ogden of our fellowship, that take a preterist interpretation that really think that chapters 12 through 22 are continuing the same focal point of the first 11 chapters. And that is these preterist interpreters have taken the entire book of Revelation as being focused on and fulfilled before AD 70. And so basically the whole book of Revelation has already been completed. It was a prophecy for the early church in that period of time, and it's been finished and fulfilled and done with, basically. It's all fulfilled. And so it was fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem. The whole thing was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. There are some other interpreters that would take the first 11 chapters as focusing on the destruction of Jerusalem, and then the second 12 chapters focusing on the destruction of Rome, or the Babylon being described as Rome. And so people like Moses Stewart, Jay Adams, David Clark, and to some degree Homer Haley, although he takes more of a late preterist interpretation and even an idealist kind of historical background interpretation. And so the way that specific items in chapter 12 are identified will depend on the kind of framework that you're taking for the entire book. There are futurists that will look at the woman here, like, who is the woman? Okay, a great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, and so forth. Who is this woman? And if you're taking a futurist interpretation, that is, it's all going to be fulfilled in the future, there are people that would like Ladd and Mounce and several others would, John Walvoord would take this to be the woman is Israel, and the 12 stars on the crown on her head would refer to the 12 tribes of Israel. So the woman is Israel, the Old Testament nation of Israel. And so when she is going away, and the woman is fleeing away into the wilderness, this is the Old Testament nation of Israel. And some interpreters will also say that this is actually the wilderness of Judea, and that it refers to the same events that Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 24, and the gospel parallels in Mark chapter 13 and in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, where Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in those passages. And so this is just simply another parallel account of that same event. This is essentially the interpretation of Foy Wallace in his commentary on the book of Revelation, and also the commentary by Art Ogden. If we look at the futurist interpretation, just to kind of give you some idea of the interpretations that are out there, some of the people that you might associate with at work or friends or family, or other people that you might even be involved with when you ever have the topic of the book of Revelation come up. These are some of the events, the way that the interpretations are given, and I'll give you some examples of this. For example, fleeing to the wilderness, this passage here, in verse 6, here's the woman is Israel, it's the Old Testament people, and the flight to the wilderness is the literal Jewish people, and they will be persecuted by an antichrist and will flee for refuge into the wilderness of southern Palestine. Commentators like Walvoord and Ryrie and Hal Lindsey, they all specify the specific place, and they talk about this as Petra, the city of Petra, in the Jordanian wilderness south of the Dead Sea. In fact, if we look at verse 14, getting just a little bit ahead of ourselves, with the great eagle in the sky, Hal Lindsey says that this refers to a massive airlift transport across the rugged terrain of this Jordanian wilderness. And Lindsey goes on to say that since the eagle is the national symbol of the United States, it's possible that the airlift will be made available by aircraft from the United States 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. This is what he says in his book, There's a New World Coming. It obviously takes a futurist interpretation. When we think, there's a couple of things I would say about the woman. One of the things that comes to mind is Mary, the mother of Jesus, because most all interpreters will refer to the male child here as Jesus. In verse 5, she brought forth a male child. Who is the male child? Hendrickson, in his commentary, really says that nearly all commentators of all schools agree that the child is Christ, unquote. And so really all interpreters will take this male child to be Jesus. But since it is an apocalyptic figurative image type of literature, that does not necessarily mean that the woman is Mary. It could be Mary. It could also refer to God's people in the New Testament, and we'll talk about that as well. I mean, I mentioned that in chapter 11 that God's people that were facing persecution were described as two witnesses, two lampstands, two prophets, and so forth. And all of those different images were referring to the same group of people to encourage them to go through this ordeal and struggle, and they'll be able to do that with God's help. And so the idea here is that Satan is struggling and striving to defeat Jesus Christ. I think those main ideas are pretty clear. That the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, that he might devour her child when she brought it forth. So you think about the time of Jesus' birth, and if we go back to the time of Jesus' infancy and the birth, and Joseph and Mary and so forth, you remember the story where they left and they fled down into Egypt because King Herod was going around with this edict to try to kill all of the male children 2 years of age and under. And so they were able to escape his wrath by bringing Jesus down into Egypt and so forth. And There's the quotation in Matthew where out of Egypt I have called my son, having a reference to the fulfillment of a prophecy from the book of Hosea. And so you have Satan striving to kill Jesus at the time of his birth. It could also be referring to the time of Jesus' temptations, when in Matthew chapter 4, Satan is tempting Jesus. And Jesus could have succumbed to those temptations, but he did not. So he was striving to overcome Jesus at that time. And yet a third interpretation is when Jesus was dying on the cross of Calvary, and this is when he was made both Lord and Christ, according to Acts chapter 2 and verse 36. And so even through his crucifixion is when he was able to complete perfectly the will of God and come into this position of being the Messiah and Savior for all the world. Satan was striving to overthrow Jesus in every one of these cases. His birth, when Herod tried to kill all the male children, in his temptation of Jesus, when he was striving to tempt him in a very fierce way over 40 days and 40 nights, and even at the time of the crucifixion where Satan thought he had achieved a victory, but lo and behold, it was not a victory, but instead Jesus was the one who was victorious. Now verse 6 says, the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which to be nourished for 1,260 days. This verse lends me to believe that the woman is the church, that the woman refers to the Christians, in the sense that because of our faith, we continue to bring forth Jesus in our lives every time we let our light shine before men, even in the midst of persecution. But the woman fled into the wilderness, and the wilderness really refers to the God's care for his church throughout history. I mean, we're in the wilderness of struggle and temptation, and it's going to be for a short while. An earlier passage says 10 days. Here it talks about 1,260 days, which is another way of talking about 3.5 years, which is half of 7. So you have 3.5, which is 1/2 of 7. And 7 is this number for completion and perfection and so forth. So that you will have a wonderful promise of heaven if you go through this short period of ordeal. Foy Wallace, as I mentioned in this commentary on the book of Revelation, talks about this in the context of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, and talking about the third of the stars of heaven falling, he maintains that the political world that was subject to these destructions was Jerusalem, Judaism, and the Jewish state. And the pending events of the destruction of the Jewish world, represented by the destruction of Jerusalem and the downfall of Judaism and the end of the Jewish state, is what these verses, of course, are referring to. And so there's some to be commended in this approach, as I mentioned before. I don't really see it that way myself, but I do think that as you look in this commentary, there are significant portions of this commentary by Brother Wallace that I think are extremely informative and very helpful. And he also refers to the fact that these events would be encouraging to Christians of subsequent generations as we look to similar ordeals and struggles that we have ourselves. Verse 7 continues, now war arose in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. And he was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives unto death. This is an amazing image, is it not? War arose in heaven. This is a war of the spiritual dimension. It's just what the Apostle Paul was speaking of in Ephesians chapter 6, that we're fighting against principalities and powers. And I think really the key, we can look at some of the specifics of who this dragon is, and verse 9 gives us an unequivocal answer here. This dragon is the devil. It is Satan. It specifically and explicitly says this. And this war is going on. And it's going on in heaven. It's the heavenly counterpart to the earthly warfare that we are involved with every day that we struggle as Christians. And the first century disciples had to struggle as well. They were in the context of Roman persecution. Certainly the first disciples also had Jewish persecution in the when the church was first established in Jerusalem, and we have the apostles going forth and they're going to be God's witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth. They faced persecution, struggles, trials, temptations, and ordeals every step of the way. And so those Christians that were involved in serving Jesus in Jerusalem before the destruction of Jerusalem had these same struggles. The Christians in the 7 churches of Asia, when the Emperor Domitian was expanding his persecution throughout the Mediterranean basin against all people who were following Jesus, they had that struggle as well. And they also had the temptation to not be faithful to Jesus. And this book is addressed to them to encourage them to remain faithful even if it costs them their lives. And a key verse here is found in verse 11, where it tells us that the salvation has come to God's people. Why? Because they have conquered this dragon. How did they conquer the dragon? Well, there are 2 things mentioned. They conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, number 1. And secondly, by the word of their testimony. And so Christians are able to overcome Satan and his angels and all of the struggles that they have to endure by the blood of Jesus Christ that cleanses us from all sin. But also we are able to overcome by the word of our testimony, by our lives, by doing what God wants us to do. And notice what it says here at the end of verse 11, because they loved not their lives even unto death. You see, there's this inherent intuitive desire to stay alive. It's part of the survival, the instinct that we have within us. And as human beings, we want to keep living. We understand, we acknowledge from a mental understanding of the situation that we will die someday, of course. We just don't want it to be now. And so when there is the temptation to worship the emperor instead of Jesus or in addition to Jesus, just a little pinch of incense here and there, not a big deal. And when that temptation comes our way, then we're able to justify it by saying, okay, I'll go ahead and do this. At least it will buy me another day, and I'll be able to buy and sell in the marketplace and do conducting of my business and feed my family and take care of them. And of course, my children need food, don't they? And so all of these things we can think about in our minds to justify the compromise that some Christians would be tempted to do. But these people that are reading this apocalypse would be encouraged to realize that they would be ultimately victorious because of two things: the blood of Jesus and their own faithfulness. And if they remain faithful unto God, then they will have this wonderful victory and salvation and power and kingdom and authority of Jesus Christ has come. Why? Because we have not loved our lives more than Jesus. We have not loved our lives even unto death, to avoid death, but rather to give up our lives for Jesus, just as he gave up his life for us. We'll talk a little bit on Sunday morning in our next class, a little more background about this passage and the dragon and the angels, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven and so forth. But suffice it to say here that the nitty-gritty battles that we are involved with as Christians, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, to use another metaphor or figure of speech, is that we are going to be faced with trials and temptations. How are we going to endure when those temptations come? And for all of us, it may be something different. And in each generation, each time and point of time in history, the struggle might be a little bit different. I happen to think that this particular period of time in this year, 2020, with the COVID pandemic and all of the social unrest in our nation and the political chaos that seems to be going on, all of these kinds of things really put us in a particular framework of mind that is challenging us to remain faithful and focused on the spiritual things. It's really easy to get distracted about the things around us and not pay close attention to the Bible reading, our prayer life, our fellowship with each other. In fact, the fellowship that we have has been impacted by all of the social distancing and the fact that we're even having Bible class here on Wednesday evening by a virtual voiceover on a PowerPoint slide presentation. These kinds of things, as beneficial and as helpful as this might be, it's still different than what we normally engage in. And because things are different, there are times when we might lose our focus and not really be focused on the blessings that we have in God in any case. Verse 12 says, "Rejoice then, O heaven, and you who dwell therein. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows his time is short." As I mentioned at the beginning, that this chapter 12 brings us back in a flashback kind of a way of thinking about the background of what's been going on. That there are these 7 seals from the scroll, and there's 7 trumpets and so forth. And what's really going on here? It's a spiritual struggle, and it starts from the very beginning. We're not given as great detail as we might like, but questions like, where did Satan come from? Is Satan a fallen angel? And there are just a very few groups of passages in the Bible that even give us clues. And sometimes the context of those passages don't really give us, unless it means more than one thing, precisely what it's referring to. Satan, for example. Luke chapter 10 is a passage we'll look at Sunday morning in this connection, but suffice it to say at this point that while we have inquiring minds, we would like to know some answers about where Satan came from and all of his angels and so forth. What God created all things were good, and yet there's this thing we call Satan, evil, the devil. Where did this start? We know from the beginning of the Bible that the serpent and beguiler was there at the very beginning in the Garden of Eden and tempted Eve, and she ate of the forbidden fruit. She also gave it to her husband Adam, and he ate, and so they were both guilty of sin. And Satan accuses all of us. We all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, and he accuses each one of us. He can stand and say to God, each one of these human beings are guilty of sin, and he would be right. And therefore, each person is deserving of eternal damnation and separation from God for all eternity. Isn't that correct? Well, of course, the answer to that is, well, technically, yes. They can't. People can't be in God's presence because of them being guilty of sin. But the blood of the Lamb has paid the price for them. So there was a propitiation. There was a substitution made. And God's wrath and his justice has been vindicated because the price has already been paid. You don't have to pay it. I don't have to pay it. Other Christians don't have to pay it. Why? Because Jesus paid it all, just like we sing in the song. And so this background of Satan is being described here. And in heaven, Satan used to be there, and now he's no longer there, and his realm of operation, the realm in which he is really operating, is on planet Earth, and he is roaming and going about seeking somebody to devour, as other passages of the Bible tell us. And so it tells us here, you better beware, earth and sea, because the devil is not up here in heaven, he's down there where you are. And he also knows that his time is short, that he only has a certain limited time in which to operate, and he's going to try and make the most of his time. So the people that are on earth and the earth dwellers that are living on earth, and their focus and their idea is the material world, they need to beware, because they're not alone. There is this accuser out there striving to take advantage of them. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had borne the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle, that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time, times, and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river which the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon was angry with the woman, and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and bear testimony to Jesus. And he stood on the shore of the sea. So the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth. This is Satan, down on planet Earth, and he doesn't like his predicament any more than others. And so what's he going to do? He's going to pursue the woman who had borne the male child. We've already mentioned the male child is Jesus the Christ. So if we take this literally, the woman would be Mary. But this is an apocalyptic book, and it doesn't make a clear sense to me that this would be Mary just exclusively. I think It might include Mary, but it's referring to Christians. And I think this is true when you think at verse 17 that the dragon is angry with the woman, and the dragon went off to make war with the rest of her offspring. Who's the rest of her offspring? Well, the text tells us those who keep the commandments of God and bear testimony to Jesus. These are Christians. Christians in the first century and Christians in the 21st century. This is you and me living in the year 2020. We are part of the rest of her offspring. We are those who keep the commandments of God. We are people who bear the testimony to Jesus. So, this is why I don't just take the woman literally to be Mary, but it might include Mary as a Christian and all of those who follow in Mary's example of being Christians, and also the offspring of the woman, which would be other Christians too. You might say, well, this doesn't make sense because how can it be both Mary or not Mary? And this is apocalyptic literature, people. This is not linear, literal, 1, 2, 3 types of a sentence where you have just an exact reference from one to the other like a normal narrative. That's not what this kind of literature is. It's picture language. And the pictures are this horrific dragon. And we're about to see in chapters 13 an earth beast and a sea beast. And this is all horrible, horrific stuff, scary to even think about. And the idea is that we are living in a scary place. And there are things that are taking place that we can't even see. That there is evil and wickedness in heavenly places. And when I say heavenly, I mean in the spiritual realm, in the dimension that is not the physical material world, but the things that cause things to take place in the physical material world. Our fighting is against principalities and powers in the heavenly places. And this is a picture of war in heaven. It starts in heaven, it comes to earth, and the venue and the theater of this war is earth, and it is a horrific battle. And you see this serpent chasing this woman in the wilderness. I know that Hal Lindsey is talking about this great eagle being a massive airlift transport taken from the Jordanian wilderness and so forth, and this is really pure speculation. It sells a lot of books, I will say that people who have made and written books on this and tried to make it fit specific kinds of things. I'll give you some suggestions on Sunday morning, but if I had a mind to write a book about the political events of 2020 using the imagery from the book of Revelation, I think I could probably do a good job and be persuasive and convincing, at least to some people. If you've been paying close attention to me, hopefully I wouldn't be persuasive to you and convince you because you understand the basic meaning of the book of Revelation. But if we don't have that background of context, then it's really easy to be duped and persuaded into thinking other things. Well, I think that's a good place for us to conclude this evening. This is just an amazing vision. We'll talk a little more about some of the specific details on Sunday morning, but I think the main focal point is fairly clear, and whenever the Bible gives us specific things to interpret itself, we really have to latch onto that and take hold of that. Because when it says the rest of her offspring in verse 17, it tells us who that refers to. People who keep God's commandments. People who bear testimony to Jesus. And this refers to the first original readers of the book for sure, but by extension, it refers to all of us who bear testimony to Jesus and keep the commandments of God, of every generation, of every place, and of every time. Thank you for joining us in our study of chapter 12 of the book of Revelation tonight, and we'll continue our study with God's blessings on Sunday morning as we explore not only a little more detail of chapter 12, but also looking into chapter 13 of this fantastic book of Revelation. May God bless you.